By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik in Washington, D.C. I'm your host, Sean Blackmon, here with Jackie Lukman. And as always, we are your guide for connecting the political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us. And today on By Any Means Necessary, we'll be marking the anniversary of the Cuban Revolution. Also going to be talking about the main challenges facing the new Brazilian president, Lula da Silva. And it's Tuesday, which means we're having our weekly segment, Tech for the People. And as always, at 3:20 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, we'll be taking your calls. But to kick things off today, we are very happy to be joined by Arnold August, a Montreal-based author of 3 books on U.S., Cuba, Latin America relations. He is an award-winning journalist, publishes in English, Spanish, and French on several continents, collaborates with Telesur, Cuba TV, and Press TV Iran, is a contributing editor for the Canada Files, and a member of the International Manifesto group. Arnold, thanks so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure for me to be with you once again.
Absolutely. And of course, Arnold, on January 1st, 1959, the 26th of July movement led by Fidel Castro was able to oust the U.S.-backed dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista, setting in motion the socialist revolution in Cuba, which has been the order of the day in that country in the ensuing decades. Of course, not without the incessant and seemingly never-ending attack from the world's most powerful governments, certainly including that of the United States. And, you know, I was thinking about this, Arnold, and I feel like it's not true to say that not a lot is known about pre-revolutionary Cuba, but I do think that in the U.S. and the West, there actually isn't enough credence or interrogation or investigation into just the kind of country that Cuba was before the revolution in 1959. I think that really helps contextualize what it is that the revolution has been doing in the years since. And so to begin, before we even get to January 1st, 1959, help us understand some of the context of the Batista dictatorship, the sort of place Cuba was like, and what ultimately motivated those revolutionaries.
Well, Fidel Castro himself, as you know, the first recent attempt to reignite the Cuban Revolution started with the attack on the Moncada barracks back in July 26, 1953, and Fidel Castro was captured after that. And in his defense, he defended himself as a lawyer. He defended himself with a very important statement, which has become to known, history will absolve me. Here, he pointed out all of the complete subordination of Cuba to the United States when he spoke there in his trial. He pointed out, amongst other things, for example, that the almost all of the good land, or virtually all the good land, farming land, and Cuba is rich in farmland. It has red earth, which is very favorable for growing sugarcane. All that, those were in the hands of a very small minority of wealthy landowners, both Cuban as well as Americans. Literacy, forget about it. In Cuba before 1959, there was virtually most of the people were illiterate. They had no contact with schools, no contact with doctors. Evictions were a very commonplace situation whereby, in an arbitrary manner, the owners of land, etc., would throw people out of their houses. The main industries were all in the hands of the United States, in collaboration, we have to say, with some of the wealthy, very wealthy Cuban landlords. The housing was also in the hands of this very small minority. And then there's other features which are more well known to a non-Cuban audience, whether it's the United States and Canada, is that there is, to put it bluntly, Cuba before 1959 was the playground of the United States ruling circle, and specifically the mafia, where they just, jumped on a plane, a half an hour later, whatever, they arrived in Havana, and that was their playground, complete with prostitution and all of the cultural features that favored U.S. domination. So it was, the workers, unions were suppressed violently. We can go on and on, but that is the basic situation that Cuba was facing in the 1950s that actually was overthrown by Fidel Castro on January 1st, 1959. And if I may, I think while we're reflecting on the past, a lot of people and it's quite well known when the Grandma landed in eastern Cuba on December 2nd, 1956, the landing there was a disaster in the sense that they were not able to reach the solid beachhead where they were heading to because of bad waters, the very bad conditions of the yacht Grandma, and they landed in a swampland. And in the course of the days following that, semi-disastrous landing, they lost most of their ammunition, many men, and rifles. Now, here's a story I think that, to appreciate the Cuban Revolution, that overthrow that old system that existed before. I like this small anecdote that was later made public by Raul Castro. After they landed in eastern Cuba in very bad conditions, Fidel Castro and the people around him finally made contact with Raul Castro a few days later. And Fidel asked Raul, first thing he said, "How are you?" But he asked, "How many rifles do you have?" Well, Raul said, I have 5. And Fidel said, "Okay, I have 2. That makes a total of 7. That means we can win the war." I think it's really important for people, in capitalist countries, just to see, let that sink in, not just turn the page, 5 and 7, but we have 7 rifles, we will win the war. It shows how optimistic and daring the Cuban Revolution was in that incipient stage. It was just 7 rifles, a handful of men, and, less than 2 years, they actually overthrew the Batista regime, which is completely armed, financed by the United States, and a very powerful, not only army, they had helicopters, they had airplanes. But they defeated them on January 1st, 1959. 1959, that is really, I think, a momentous page of Cuban human history. Because, we are familiar with other revolutions, for example, the Bolshevik Revolution, the Chinese Revolution, more recently, the Bolivarian Revolution. But in my view, that specific instant, or that anecdote by Raul, there was virtually nothing. They were able to defeat the U.S.-backed Batista regime and, rolled into Santiago on January 1st, 1959. A momentous, historic event that I think we could never forget, and also raise, not just on January 1st, 1959, but throughout the year. As you say, the United States has relentlessly tried everything to subvert the Cuban Revolution. But this Cuban Revolution was born in that spirit with only 7 rifles, a few men. They did what was thought to be impossible and overthrow the U.S.-backed Batista regime.
Definitely. And, of course, here in the U.S., and I know certainly in Canada and in the West in general, for several decades now, we've been fed this narrative about Cuba and the revolutionary Cuban government as this despotic dictatorship that, gets some sick joy out of torturing its people and depriving them of basic things that they need. But what we're never told is the direct role that the Cuban people have and continue to play in the fact that the revolution itself is still ongoing and still being built and maintained. And this is a broad question, Arnold, but I was hoping you could sort of speak to that aspect of things, because without the support of the Cuban people, then the revolution simply crumbles.
That's exactly it. That's the main story of that, 1956, 1957. They had only 7 rifles, a few men, but with the support of the people and in conjunction with the people, the peasants as well as the workers, they were able to carry out that miracle of defeating Batista. Let us take one example of what you mentioned as possible slanders that goes on against the Cuban Revolution, that it's despotic and all that. How many people know? I mean, unless you read my book, my first book on the elections in Cuba, that while on the one hand the United States or the West in general continuously, either openly or indirectly, say that Cuba is a dictatorship, there were no elections, etc. But do you know what happened in 1959, 1960, 61? That Fidel Castro, in mass speeches, and if those who have seen photographs or footage of these mass speeches, Fidel Castro exchanges with the thousands and even sometimes millions of people in front of him, throwing out ideas, getting feedback. And on 3 different occasions in that early period, 1959, 1960, Fidel Castro raised the possibility that we should have elections. You know that actually was booed down by the people in that crowd. Why? Not because the Cuban people were despotic, they don't want elections and all that, but because the Cuban people, the only experience they had regarding elections before 1959 was the so-called two-party system. We're familiar with that in the West. That one dictator wins an election. Once he loses his credibility, they switch to someone else to favor his election, and so on and so forth. So the people did not want elections at that time because this is their only experience that they had with it. And secondly, they rightly asked, and Fidel expanded on that in those early speeches in the 1950s, early 60s, that we have to concentrate on our main goal at this time, and that is to improve the economic situation in Cuba. For example, the majestic literacy campaign that took place right after the revolution. This has to be carried out, as well as other activities. For example, the need to develop the health system after the majority of doctors in Cuba left Cuba after the revolution. So he pointed, we have all these things to accomplish. Why should we stop these advances that we are making, despite the difficulties, in order to please some foreign notion that you have to have elections? And therefore, elections did not take place in Cuba until 1976. And in my view, that was a major correct decision because they were able to carry out their activities, as you say, in conjunction with the people. One of the main features of this type of how democracy works in Cuba is that at one point, I think it was 1960 or 1961, there was a speech by Fidel Castro in Havana, an important public speech. And the crowd and Fidel heard 2 or 3 sort of explosions somewhere in the crowd. It looked very menacing. What was going to happen? So Fidel just said, what we have to do, we have to develop defense committees in all of the areas across Cuba to defend ourselves from any possibility of provocations or even attacks by the U.S. and its allies in Cuba. And out of that exchange, I repeat, it's an exchange. Fidel and the people and Fidel came this common decision. Fidel, and what we need is these committees in the neighborhoods, which later became known, and many people who visit Cuba from the United States and elsewhere have a chance to visit the Comité de Defensa de la Revolución. That is the committees in defense of the revolutions were spontaneously being built within the neighborhoods. So people were able to make sure that no U.S. infiltrator gets into the area in order to try to carry out provocations against Cuba. So, you can say this is, one of the first steps of Cuban democracy, establishing the Comité de Defensa de la Revolución. Of course, this does not follow into the U.S. or Western definition or paradigm of what democracy is, but in Cuban condition, that was one of the most important first steps in the establishment of democracy and later on elections in Cuba.
Definitely. And, I was also thinking, Arnold, about the international impacts of the Cuban Revolution, which I think are many in a number of ways, both in terms of people-to-people experience and militarily and all those sorts of things. And so it's not just something, certainly it was beneficial and continues to be in a number of ways for the Cuban people, and I think Latin America as well. But I mean, what do you think are some of the most sort of pertinent international examples of what the Cuban Revolution has wrought over these last several decades?
Well, as you were speaking and developing your point, my thought went back to a webinar that took place about 6-7 months ago on with the World Beyond War organization, and there was a debate. Myself and the host were debating on whether wars can ever be justified. Well, one of the examples I gave is that yes, they can be justified. For example, a very clear illustration of that is upon the request of the South African revolutionaries and the people in Angola, Cuba sent soldiers to carry out a war against apartheid. You know, this is it was not the first, but it was an act that sort of, how should we say, that amplifies or provides a very important image of what Cuba means internationally. They went to war in Angola, sacrificing Cuban people on African soil in order to liberate South Africa from the apartheid regime, and they succeeded in doing so. And as soon as that was done, did they try to stay there and establish themselves or take resources or whatever from Africa? No, they just went home, empty-handed in a sense, but with the conviction that they carry out an important international task in defeating the apartheid regime. There are many other examples. For example, the close ties, what is very well known, the medical brigades that are sent from Cuba all over the world. This became, world famous, that even many of the mainstream media in the West had to acknowledge the fact that while some countries were unable to cope with COVID-19, that the Cubans sent medical brigades to help other countries to combat COVID-19, in addition to, of course, fighting or resisting against the spread of COVID-19 on the island, which they did with a great deal of success. But almost all of the main Cuban policies find its expression internationally as well. And I guess more recently is very close ties between, in my view, and very important, with Venezuela. That how much help did Cuba provide Venezuela? The whole literacy campaign in Venezuela was based on what the literacy campaign in Cuba, but Cuba helped Venezuela to carry out a struggle against illiteracy, as well as, of course, very notoriously and very well known, where Cuba was and is fundamental in helping Venezuela develop its health system, with a surplus of doctors that are trained in Cuba being sent to Venezuela on a permanent basis. So these are, some examples of Cuba on the international scale. I think that, Fidel Castro won the revolution in 1959, but from that time on, he became an international public figure, public personality, that whether people hated him or loved him, no one could deny the role of Fidel Castro over all these years, resisting the attacks by the United States to take over their country. So there's a lot of discussion now, and rightly so, I believe, internationally, with regards to a new geopolitical, multipolarity world being developed against U.S. hegemony. And in that, they always give important emphasis to, and rightly so in my view, to China, Iran, Russia, etc. But there's a small country called Venezuela called Cuba, I'm sorry, that, cannot compare in terms of economy or whatever to Russia, China, and Iran. But because of the stature and importance of Venezuela, of Cuba, as exemplified by Fidel Castro, they are also playing, in their own way, an important role in developing this multipolar world against U.S. hegemony.
Absolutely. Well, we thank you so much, Arnold, for joining us today. We're going to leave it there. We'll move to a break here on By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik in Washington, D.C. We'll be right back, so please stay with us.
By any means necessary.